thank you all for being here to have this first panel of this amazing event. This is my first year doing this. I don't know how many times y'all have been out to it, but this has just been already an amazing and an incredibly rewarding experience. I am so honored to share this stage right now with Adam Nagourney from the New York Times, who has written an amazing book. And if you haven't read it yet, you need to make sure that you do. I've worked in politics for pretty much my entire career. I know I look young, but I'm a little bit older than I look. And this is one of the most absolute best reads of any book I've encountered in my career. It really gives you an insight into how human the New York Times is. I think it's so easy for those of us who have worked in politics to think of these institutions, these larger-than-life American institutions, as something that's not quite a living, breathing organism. And you do such an amazing job just bringing it to life. And really, my takeaway from reading the book was how human of a place this organization is, and how it reflects the human condition and the struggles that all of our society and culture have had to navigate going through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s today. I'm just curious, just right off the bat, how is it that this book came to be and that you were the one that got to write it?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for those very kind words about my book. I want to kind of end this right now before I screw it up. I always wanted to work for the New York Times. If you had met me in college, I would have told you that I wanted to be the chief political reporter for the New York Times, which actually is a job I got to be. And I read Gay Talese. I did the whole thing. It was just a big part of my life. My father worked at the Times Publishing Company. So I always wanted to work there. And then at some point, and I've tried to figure out when it was, I decided I wanted to write a book on the Times in sort of the spirit of Gay Talese's book. It can never be as good as Talese's book. If any of you have read it, it's fantastic. But I felt there was a need to do it. And I thought about it for a long, long time. And then at a certain point in 2016, I just decided, this is a passion. This is something I want to do. There are obstacles, starting with the fact that I work there now. And could I actually do this? But I decided I would do it. And I just went to my agent, Kathy Robbins, and we took it around. And there was significant interest in the publishing industry. And here we are today.
What was it like? I can't imagine what it'd be like to go to my boss and go, hey, I'm going to write a book about the history of your entire workplace, good, bad, and indifferent. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. That's a very good question. First of all, the book ends in 2016, so I'm almost exclusively writing about people who are gone. So I wasn't writing, with one or two exceptions, I was not writing for people that I worked with or worked for, which made this a lot easier. Sure. I think it wouldn't have been tenable, frankly. When I decided I wanted to do this, I went to Arthur Sulzberger Jr., who was the publisher at the time. He has since retired, and laid out the plan. And he's a very reasonable, thoughtful guy. And he said, let me think about it. And he came back to me, and 5 weeks later, he's deliberative, and said, yes, I will cooperate with you. I will sit down. I will give you whatever interviews you want. I said, Arthur said, the one thing I will not do is I will not tell anyone else what to do. You should not expect anyone else to give you interviews. And I was like, sure, I'll take it. What I did not realize, and this is that once the publisher of the New York Times says he's going to sit down and do these interviews with you, everyone does. So pretty much, I can't think of any exceptions. Maybe one. Everyone who's alive, obviously, and is subject to this book gave me time and very often access to the personal papers.
Yeah, and that was the thing, too, that I think is so unique when we look at the world that we live in today, one of technology, one of cell phones and tablets and digital exchanges of information. Here you are able to write a book that actually, it seems like at least, relies a lot on actual paper.
Oh my God, yeah.
And that you must have had access to a tremendous amount of notes and memos and just the hard sourcing materials that in today's era would not exist in the same way. What was that like?
Oh, Kurt, that was a huge deal. And I don't think I realized what a huge deal it was until I was done and realized that people don't write memos on paper anymore. And memos that are on email are purged after a couple of years for security reasons. I had access to boxes and boxes and boxes of papers at the New York Public Library where the official archives was, but then also the executive editors later on, after the archival project was unfortunately stopped for financial reasons, just gave me boxes of their papers and said, have at it. I can't imagine doing a book like this without that because, I think, in my opinion, I was dealing with honest people who were doing their best to recall and reconstruct for me events that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and maybe not in this room, but certainly with me, memories certainly fail after a while, and you remember things the way you want to remember them. So having these contemporaneous memos, reports, a couple cases, diaries that someone kept and shared with me, access to oral histories that were done at the time with various people was just crucial in reconstructing this book and being sure of, as much as possible, the accuracy of what I was writing. Very quickly to your point, if I had to write a sequel to this book, which I don't think I would, I'm the wrong person, but somebody should, it's going to be much harder because these documents just don't exist.
Well, it's interesting because I remember very vividly reading the passage about the spaceship blowing up.
Yep.
And at that time, what obviously a national moment that was. And when reading it through your lens, it takes you right. You are right there in a newsroom, and you are living and breathing. And for many of you here, probably reliving that experience. I think through so many of these major events that you tackle in the book, you lived it once as a human being, mm-hmm. like the rest of us. How did reliving some of these major events, like the spaceship blowing up, what was it like reliving it through the lens of all of these people in this newsroom?
Yeah, so that's a great example. As of September 11th, it's the terrorist attacks of September 11th. It was very important for me to tell the story of how the Times told the story. It's very important in a book like this, in my opinion, to remember the journalism, to remember why it is that people read the paper or whatever you want to call it, the phone. And that what I think distinguishes the Times is that it does such amazing jobs on these big stories. And how do you do it? So in the case of the Challenger explosion, I thought it happened that there was somebody from the Times History Project who was in the newsroom at the time videotaping what was going on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I had all these live videotapes of what was going on. They were having these discussions. And it was really interesting because you could see the executive editor at the time, a man named Abe Rosenthal, sort of make this decision. Is this sort of just a momentary story, right? Just a horrible tragedy? Or is this the kind of thing that the Times goes full bore on? And he decided at that moment that this is a moment that would change American history, that it would change the space space shuttle program, that millions and millions of people, remember, people were watching this on TV. School children were watching this on TV when a teacher died, would never forget it. So he just cleared the whole front page, cleared the whole front section. Everything in the New York Times was about that tragedy. And he also decided what the front page headline was. It was just really a big deal. September 11th was, again, that was an event I was writing about that I realized pretty much everyone who was reading this book would have lived through or remembered. I thought that was a way of telling this really important story of how the Times tackled such a huge tragedy, most of which was in its backyard, the World Trade Center. Mm-hmm. And how that reporters and editors who were covering this were also dealing with tragedies that were going on around them, and that they had to deal with this overwhelming story. They couldn't get the newspaper physically out of the trucks because of all the tunnels were closed down. People were experiencing this themselves. They didn't know whether reporters and editors were dying. And the way I did that is I found, at the time, they did an internal house organ internal house sort of publication, where various people recounted their experiences that day. So wow. Trying to get across the Brooklyn Bridge to deliver film, getting pictures developed and then sending them by, at the time, it seemed revolutionary, modem, right? How people got notes back. How you remember the feature about people who died there, the section, right? How that came to be, right? The realization of editors and reporters that there are no survivors, right? That we have to figure out a way to deal with the fact that there are no survivors. So I spent a lot of time in that chapter because I wanted it to feel fresh and new and dramatic. And I didn't want to tell it solely through the eyes of the executive editor, Howell Raines, who was sort of running the ship and making the big decisions. I wanted to make it through the reporters and editors and, for that matter, stenographers who were brought in to take down what people were saying when they called in, what they said in their reports.
Well, I was struck too by just some of these anecdotes because, again, it's so funny to read this book in 2024 and think there was a time where there wasn't necessarily a 24/7 put something up immediately online type of mentality that we live in now. That the person that was operating the overnight desk wasn't really a senior person, wasn't really a seasoned person.
Right.
And then for something as large of the scale of 9/11 to happen. And people filtering in that may not have normally been there or on their way there, it just shows how different newsrooms operate today versus when we've had some big events happen that were unexpected. And the race to get something up online today drives so much of our news culture, drives so much of our political conversation. It's who can get out fastest, who can put out the first statement, who can get on cable news first. Whereas you see over the course of your book, the deliberate deliberation of big stories, of not actually trying to be necessarily the first one up, but to actually get it right.
So that's a great point. That was a turning point in the paper's history because while the paper was doing what it does, Serge Schmemann was writing the lead story. There was a guy named James Barron, who some of you might know. He's a longtime writer, wonderful, wonderful writer, who they kind of put aside and said, "Can you please take care of the digital report?" And all day long, he would be updating what was going on for the digital report. Everyone else had no idea he was, like Serge Schmemann told me later that he had no idea that he was doing this, right? That no one was paying attention to James
and he was kind of bummed out getting that assignment because he knew no one was going to read the paper. They were reading the paper, not watching the website, he thought.
Because he's an old school guy like me, and he's like, oh yeah, I want to, right? But then he realized after a while that this is where everyone was going because everyone was learning that day. That's how you get your most up-to-date New York Times. The site, they kept changing the technology of the site because so many readers were coming to it that it was closing down. And James tells me a great story of a couple weeks later, he went back to writing a New York Times Society column. And he was at a book party like at Peter Jennings' house because that's what New York Times reporters do, of course. And everyone was coming up to him and saying how they read the 9/11 coverage by him that day. All these TV people, producers, reporters. And that's when it struck home to him and a lot of people in the newsroom that this was the future. It took a long time until that actually happened, but you're right, because that was a clash of the two cultures.
You know, it's interesting, reading the book, I kind of came away thinking about it almost as if there were two New York Timeses going on. There's the New York Times that excelled in these moments of coverage, where the talent of all the people really shine through, where they function at their absolute best. And then there's the New York Times of competing interests, of ambition, of conflict, of hierarchy. It's kind of almost as if Succession met House of Cards in some ways.
I like that.
and that's, again, not having the insights, because everyone like us, we just get the paper, it looks great. We don't know all the machinations going on behind the scenes. And you capture that so well. And of course, everything begins and ends, with the family, and your book kind of begins with that potential handover that's going to eventually happen from father to son, and the struggles that the son, trying to live up to the father and make his own mark and make his own imprint, and the inevitable inferiority complexes that come from being the chosen one. In some ways, it reminded me a little bit of what The Crown must be like in terms of what we saw Charles struggle through with his mother over all those years. Talk a little bit, though, just about the family dynamic at play and how that has colored the history of the New York Times.
I mean, this has been in the Sulzberger family since 1896, and I would argue that one of the reasons that the New York Times is succeeding today, when so many of our other great newspapers are struggling, forgive me, the Los Angeles Times being the most obvious recent example, but also the Washington Post, just lead off, I think, 200 people, the Baltimore Sun, again and again. I think it's because it's a family newspaper, and there's a certain ethos, pride, guilt, whatever you want to say, that their name is identified with the paper, and that at time after time in this story that I write, and continuing through today, when the New York Times entered bad financial times, which that happens, of course, right? They just kept putting more money into the paper to make it better. And there's that old cliche, and everyone claims credit for it. I think it was A. Roosevelt, but who knows? Put more tomatoes in the soup, because New York Times people, readers, want quality, and I think that's what you're seeing now in terms of the paper's really phenomenal success with subscribers. That they are not only offering quality in terms of news reports with mistakes. I'm not being ridiculous, ridiculous here, but also like all kinds of other sort of things that entice people to read it. And I think that's because of the family. I mean, you've seen efforts to have a paper sort of run, saved by a wealthy billionaire. We've seen that in Los Angeles and Washington Post. I'm not sure that always ends well, and I just think that that's sort of the big impetus. And the family was just very identified and very invested, not financially, reputationally, in the New York Times. And that's why I think the New York Times is as good as it is today.
Yeah. One of the more surprising things, now I come at this as someone who, I came up in Republican politics. I'm a Democrat now, but I came up in Republican politics. And of course, the New York Times has always been a boogeyman for Republicans, a talking point about the, quote, liberal, biased media, et cetera. I was really surprised in reading the book about the cultural leanings, actually, of the ownership and of the top editors in terms of dealing with issues like sexism, dealing with racism,
Right.
dealing with equality internally. Because I was reading these passages and I'm thinking, these guys could be Republicans right now. Like, they would fit right in with that
Right.
world. It was surprising me that the contrast between the public image of the New York Times, as this more left-leaning, progressive, whatever, but internally, all of these, frankly, white men in leadership positions and ownership positions, kind of wanting to keep the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, this is certainly earlier. I don't think it's as true now or even true now. They represented, these were, you're right, white men, wealthy often, that represented, like, the sort of power structure, and they represented the culture of the time. And you'll see in this book the fact that means sexism. The treatment of women is really bad. I don't want to say racism, but because that's just not correct. It goes to motivation. But there was certainly much difficulty in getting the newspaper to represent what America looked like. I think it's gone much further now, and you'll see editors struggling with that over the years. Editors like, I don't mean to keep throwing names at you, I just figure some of you might know them. Max Frankel making an effort in the 80s, all these decades are mushed up, trying to do this, but running into institutional resistance from people, editors who would say, well, this is the New York Times, this is tokenism, we want to make decisions about who is best for the job, and it's never as simple as that. So I think very often the Times, representing the way the culture was at the time, was sort of culturally conservative on some of these issues. I do think that it has changed. Secondarily, to I think what you're asking, one of the most powerful executive editors that I write about in the book, a man named Abe Rosenthal, he was editor through 86. He was politically very conservative. I mean, not conservative like Orange County conservative, but certainly, certainly like New York conservative, and he had very conservative views on time. And he was running the paper back he was one of the people running the paper back in 1968, Vietnam, street protests in Chicago, and he just was like really wary of radicals, liberals taking over the newsroom, and he was very, very wary of reporters who were bringing their ideology into the newsroom. So this has been an ongoing struggle going on for years. I think the paper right now, obviously the editorial page is very liberal, and I think the sensibility is what I would call a New York sensibility, not geographically, more politically.
Of the many characters that you chronicle in this book, which one that you weren't aware of their story before you started this project, which one impressed you the most?
I guess two people. One was a man who just died. His name was Joe Lelyveld, and he was an executive editor. He was a long-time foreign correspondent. And I just wrote a piece for The Atlantic arguing that he was the last great print editor of the New York Times. He was old school. He understood the need for digital in an intellectual sort of way. The publisher at the time, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., was really pushing this. I think Arthur Sulzberger really saw the future. But Joe was pushing back. And Joe was also pushing back on, this will seem quaint to you, on the sort of cultural changes that were going on in terms of what was news, right? Like, we write about, like, I mean, Taylor Swift's on the front page of the paper every day. Like, he would have pushed back on that. There's a wonderful anecdote in there where, like, Princess Di died was killed in a car crash late Saturday night, as I recall, it was Saturday. It was right on deadline, and the paper remade the front page and made the story of her death a over 4 columns, 1-line headline, right? Which is a pretty big deal, right? Like, but somebody came up to Joe a couple days later and said, So Joe, if you had had more time, would you have given it a bigger headline? This is like as the whole world was convulsed with grief and upset about what had happened with her. I'm sure you all remember. And he said, if I had more time, I would have given it less space. And then, I mean, you had to love him, right? And then he was the one who was dealing with Monica Lewinsky and President Clinton and the sort of really, I mean, at this point it seems almost quaint, but at the time, the really kind of racy, seedy stuff that was coming out in the Star Report, and I'm not going to go into details, we're in a library, right? But and you could watch him struggle with this stuff, trying to get this right. And I mean, I don't want to say it's quaint because it's not quaint, but he's a really good symbol of I think, the old school paper, New York Times ethos at his heart. And he was a great character that way. The other one was more contemporary, and some of you might know him. His name was Dean Baquet. He just retired as executive editor, not just 3 years ago, I think, as executive editor. He was editor of the Los Angeles Times, of course. I think that he was the right person for the right time. He came in after another executive editor, Jill Abramson, was ousted by Arthur Sulzberger. We can talk about that for a variety of reasons. One of which is, as she told me, she just hated the job. She just didn't like the sort of digital and business kind of requirements that she encountered. Dean took over. Dean was maybe a little younger than her, but he was someone who I think understood what where the world was going, and understood that you should say yes to stuff. that the time when it was okay to say no, that's a wackadoodle idea. He said yes to stuff he didn't understand. And I think one of the reasons that the Times has gone through the transformation that we have seen journalistically and as a business enterprise, because that is ultimately what it was over the past 6 or 7 years, is because of Dean Baquet. So I think he should get a lot of credit. And he was a fascinating character because of that. But then I also came across smaller people that I never realized would be such a big deal. People like Rich Meisland, he's passed away now, but I was reading he started off as a correspondent. He was an Albany reporter. He was in Mexico City. And then he kind of moved into what you and I would call digital today. And I came across a memo from him in 1994, I think, that he shared with me, where he's saying, we have all these recipes. We should form some kind of recipe bank. And they're like, what are you talking about? It'd be lots of money. I mean, he really saw the future. And I think people like him, unsung heroes who saw the way the paper was going.
It was really interesting, I thought, kind of watching the introduction of the computer age really in the 80s to until really 9/11. Again, I never thought of 9/11 as a turning point for the digital era until I read your book, and how that was the aha moment for a lot of people who had resisted the turn to digital, who had thought, well, who's going to want to read a newspaper on their phone? That's crazy. Nobody's going to want that. That'll never go anywhere. It's just a fad. And there was a lot of that thinking of like, well, the internet, no one knows what that is. There was the disastrous launch of the Times product on AOL that you chronicle, which took us back. I remember there was a time where we would load things up on a computer and it would take like 20 seconds to just get an image to load. Kids today would never understand what that even means. But it is interesting how 9/11 was kind of that moment that flipped the switch of like, oh, maybe this is something that is worthy of investing in, throwing bodies at. A separate corporation, if you will, was formed. Different editors outside of the New York Times building itself, a whole another building, was built out. What do you think? When you look at 9/11 in terms of the lens of technology changing, like, how did that change the course and the future of the New York Times?
I think it did in a number of ways. I think for exactly the reason you said, people inside the newsroom who had resisted, not everyone, but a lot of important people realized that this is the way people were going to start getting news, and that we need to figure out a way, the paper needed to figure out a way to do it. There had been moves to doing a 24/7 news cycle before then, but it really hadn't quite happened. And they realized that you have to do it because people want news all the time. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a straight line between what happened then and where we are today. I think it just really changed the world. People at the time, I think, used to think, well, television could take care of sort of the 24/7 thing. But no, the paper was competing with television. And I think that's what they realized at the time.
Yeah, there was a moment in the book where you talk about how it might have been Junior who says, your competition isn't just the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, it's Yahoo.com,
Yeah.
it's CNN. and how that changed kind of the lens of, we're not just up against newspapers per se, we're up against the entire digital media news ecosystem that's forming around us.
And a lot of those editors and people at the paper didn't want to accept that. And part of that is, dare I say, time snobism. Like, they were like, why would we be competing with Yahoo.com? They call themselves Yahoo.com, right? Right? And there are people like, again, Joel Eliabel said he could never imagine anyone reading, the New York Times, like, on anything but print, right? And there was this long resistance, and he wasn't a freak. There were lots of people like that who just didn't believe it, or they would go through the motions, and then going down to the bottom of the chain, right? When editors in the 2000s would try to get reporters to file updates during the day just to keep their story fresh, they'd be like, well, I have 3 more phone calls to make. I mean, that makes sense to me, right? But you want to make those 3 more phone calls, but you don't have time anymore. And it took a long time to get people to sort of readjust, understand what this new world was, and begin to sort of maybe let down some of the way they did things in the past. When you see the resistance that you find in the early chapters of the book among some key people, including Arthur Sulzberger's father. In fact, starting with his father, Punch Sulzberger was a publisher. There's some comment in there. He's making a speech the same day that his son is saying we have to go in this direction in one forum the same year. He's saying, like, this is nothing. The internet's a road to nowhere. There's some crazy kind of like, internet's a road to nowhere, with cows on the road, and quite literally. And I just think they didn't realize it. They didn't accept it. And part of that has to do with the way the Times was, and maybe some people think still is to some extent, which is that the paper thinks that it's better than everyone else, and doesn't have to listen to everyone else. And I think that might have worked for a period, but that doesn't work anymore.
Well, the one thing I noticed as reading about all of these characters over the decades was how similar a lot of their backgrounds in education were. The word Harvard appears quite a lot in your book.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some of this insular thinking and some of this elitism of we're better than everyone else comes from because they all came from the same college and the same academic institution.
I mean, I think one of the problems or challenges for the Times for a long time was that it was filled with people who came up through, tend to be upper middle class, attended Ivy League schools, judged people. This is very important. Judged people whether they graduated from Ivy League schools. If I could just tell a story about myself for 1 second. I was hired by a really legendary reporter, correspondent named Johnny Apple, right? And he took me out to lunch at Galileo's in Washington, D.C. I'm like wide-eyed, right? And like classic, like he had a bottle of wine. I mean, seriously, it's at lunch. These are the old days, right? Like cordials afterwards.
It's like Mad Men up in here.
Right, yeah. And then he goes at the end, he goes, and where'd you say you worked before again? I said, USA Today. It's where I used to work. And he goes, USA Today. They're going to love that. That's remarkably counterintuitive. And like, it's true. Now, I don't think that's as true anymore. I think the paper makes an extent to cast a wider net. Because one cost of just going to the Ivies, right, is you're getting mostly a white newsroom, right? And I think they've learned that that's a mistake. But I think that sort of informed the place. And when I first started working there in 96, you could see it in the newsroom by the way people carried themselves, mostly men, by the way, the cut of their suits, the way they talked, what they did, what they read. It certainly has changed dramatically since then, but I think that has a lot to do. One of the big adjustments at the Times, which I think is accomplished, and you'll see it reading it in this book, is there was always this idea that, like, we will tell you what to read, right? That's sort of implicit in what the old print front page was.
It's not news until we say it is.
That's right. And if we don't cover it, it's not news. If we don't cover Monica Lewinsky, which they didn't really do in the early hours, it's not news, right? If Joel Eliabel wants to put a story about the war in Bosnia on the front page, knowing that no one was going to read it, because really most people won't read that, right? He did it because that's what the New York Times was about, and because he liked just sort of being naughty, right? That doesn't work anymore. I don't think the New York Times can tell people, oh, you have to read this. If you pick up your phone today, right, which is what drives subscriptions, you're going to see, you're not going to, I mean, look, I think the Times does a great job of doing both. You'll see the stories about Western water use, which I think is really important, but I don't think those are getting the most readers in the world. But you also see headlines that get lots of hits. Trump.
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, I was just going to say. You know, I mean, it's a mix now, but you can't just sort of sit there and be elitist, we know it all. You have to be responsive to what your readers want, and you have to walk the line between doing that without, I guess, catering without pandering is the way I would put it. You don't want to be chasing clicks, and I think that's the struggle for news organizations now as they try to figure out how to build their subscription base.
You know, I think one of the interesting things about this book, aside from just the history of the times and the topics and you know the internal turmoil of trying to figure out how to write about these important topics, I think it's also a book about leadership in a lot of ways. And you see how with every iteration of a new executive editor, you know, the conflict and how, you know, some reporters don't make great editors. Some editors don't make great managers. Some managers shouldn't be the top manager of everybody. And you see that trickle throughout the entire course of the book. And, you know, one of the sections I really enjoyed, one of the chapters, was during the Raines era, and how you had the conflict with Raines and Jill Abramson. You know, it kind of, all of this culminates with the whole, you know, Jason Blair fiasco. And I wonder, you know, do you think that if Raines had been able to, you know, there's the beginning of his career is a little tumultuous. He then kind of gets good advice to, like, hey, take it down a notch, make friends, not enemies. He kind of he adopts that mentality for a hot minute, and then when he gets to the perch that he really wanted to get to, he reverts back to form. Could he have survived the Jason Blair thing if he had stayed the course and taken the wisdom that was given to him earlier on in his career about how to manage?
Yes, and I think he would agree with that too, right? I think, you know, one of the reasons I think everyone know what the Jason Blair thing was. Jason Blair was a young reporter who got who did serially plagiarize stuff or just kind of make stuff up again and again and again. And when he got caught, he got fired. And he
could be president.
Yeah, right. He said that.
I am not a journalist.
He got fired, and the newsroom just exploded. And Howell Raines and the managing editor, a man named Gerald Boyd, early in the morning here, got forced out. And per your question, Kurt, I think that other executive editors could have survived that trauma. The fact of the matter is that Hal was a brilliant editor, in my opinion, a brilliant writer. He's got a great new book. The fact that he was so dictatorial, I use that word advisedly, I stand by it, and didn't care if he made enemies and moved people around and was autocratic. I think he had no friends, and that people just, you know, brought him down. I don't think that the style of management that Howell Raines and earlier on Abe Rosenthal, and later on, I would argue, Jill Abramson, these are three executive editors the book is divided into sections by executive editors. These are three of the main characters. I don't think that would exist today. I don't think you could bring that kind of personality to running a newsroom, or I think other companies, but I would defer to you people. I haven't worked at other companies that way, because I just think it's not acceptable. And I think, you know, traits like bullying, dare I say, or being autocratic, I just think that you would get purged. And I think that's one reason Howell Raines failed. The Times has a tradition of making its best reporters top editor, right? Well, as you said, you can be a great reporter. That doesn't mean you're going to be a great editor. In fact, you could argue, I kind of raise this in the book, that reporters who have been foreign correspondents, who have worked overseas, who have worked alone, who have not worked with colleagues, right, who have been sort of lone wolves, right? And that would include, you know, Abe Rosenthal, right? Would not, or Bill Keller later on, would not have the obvious skills to run a newsroom, to be collegial, to consult with other people. It's a weird culture. I get why the paper does it, and they're probably right to reward their best correspondents with this, in my opinion, top job in American journalism. But it doesn't always make sense.
I mean, there's an irony of having, you know, an entire organization of people whose sole job is to question authority, and to hold their feet to the fire and to be skeptical of leadership and rules and edicts. I cannot imagine the headache it would be to have to deal with hundreds of people who are wired that way, and that's what makes them great at what their job is.
Can you imagine being executive editor of the New York Times? Like, just for the reason you just said.
Not enough money in the world.
So then when people say to me, well, why did so-and-so step down early, right? Like, why did Max Frankel step down early? Will Joe Kahn now step down early? my initial reaction is, why would you give up the greatest job in the world? But then I think about what Kurt said, like, you are dealing with all these crazy people who are always pulling at you and pointing out your failures and like are insecure and like, I get it, right? I get like,
I came away from your book thinking, I can't believe they lasted that long. I can't believe they didn't quit sooner. And we got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to just take us through some of the characters in the book. And what I would like you to do is, when I say a name, just give me the few words of what you would like the readers of this book to come away. What do you want them to come away thinking about these characters? We'll start with the most obvious, Punch.
Old school, old style publisher who succeeded for his moment. Great character, and his heart was in the right place.
Junior.
He was maybe the most challenging person I had to write about. When I started this project, someone said, you're going to have to deal with the legacy of Arthur Sulzberger Jr. At the time, I think it would have been harsh because he had Howell Raines and Jill Abramson and a bunch of really embarrassing, Jason Blair, Judith Miller. But I think that he saved the paper. I think that he was forward-looking enough to understand the digital world, that he understood that the paper needed to change its financial sort of system, financing system, and that obviously other people get credit for this. But I think that Arthur Sulzberger's legacy is that he saved the New York Times. So all positive. And he is, I don't know if any of you know him, he is a little dorky. I mean, he just is. He's uncomfortable with people, but I think, he's in the paper's history, I think he'll be remembered as a hero.
Abe Rosenthal.
Abe Rosenthal was a brilliant, screwed up guy. Was a really good journalist and just about as tortured a person as I have ever come across. Angry, old school, homophobic, sexist. Many ways an awful person, but a good editor. And sorry to say, he would not last 5 minutes in the New York Times. Yeah. But if you go back and read his stories, they're still great. But you can just sort of watch. I came across like these private diaries. He started keeping a diary, and I just came across it in the archive. I don't think he ever thought anyone would read it. And you just realize what a screwed up dude the guy was. I mean, he was just really, but a good editor.
Betsy Wade.
Betsy Wade was another, I should have mentioned her before, of the unknown heroes of the paper. She was the first woman news desk copy editor. She was working in this overwhelmingly male environment, surrounded by men. She was not treated well. She tells a story about how the New York Times used to have spittoons in the newsroom. And at some point they banned them, thank God. But she said there was one copy editor, old school guy, who would bring a coffee can, remember those, to work and use that as a spittoon. And she said he'd walk past his desk at the end of the day every day and swirl it.
Ugh.
And she was sure he was just razzing her because she would smell it and try not to retch. Betsy was the lead plaintiff in a suit filed by the New York Times against the New York Times by women in the New York Times, charging systematic discrimination in promotion and pay. They won that suit, and I think the reason there are many women at the New York Times today is because of that suit. Betsy was in an elevator a little bit after that suit was filed with a top executive of the New York Times, and by her account, he looked at her and he said, I want you to know that we are not in the practice of promoting people who bring suit against us. And she ended her career, everyone you talk to, she was an extraordinarily talented editor. She ended her career writing I think it was the Frugal Traveler column in the travel section. Great column. I read it all the time, but I don't think that's where someone of her talent should have ended up.
Well, there's no Gail Collins if there isn't someone like her.
There's no Gail Collins. In fact, I'm pretty sure Gail said to me Gail Collins wouldn't be there were it not for her. Just throwing out names. Susan Shearer said that. Jill Amerson said that. A lot of the top women at the paper, and again, the paper still only had one woman as executive editor, thank Betsy Wade and the woman that came before her for their accomplishment today.
Gerald Boyd.
He's complicated. Gerald Boyd was the first black managing editor of the New York Times. I mentioned it before because he was fired with Howell Raines. he was a.
He was called their Jackie Robinson.
That's
in the
right.
book, yeah.
That's right. Max Franco came to him when he began promoting him, called him our Jackie Robinson. And when Gerald Boyd died after being forced out of the paper of lung cancer at this heartbreaking funeral memorial service I write about, a colleague of his from the White House, and I'm going to mention his name because you might know him, Bernie Weintraub, who's been around forever, talks about this enormous onus that Max put on Gerald Boyd by calling him our next Jackie Robinson, right? And his career, in many ways, he was really, really talented. He was always haunted by questions of was he there because he was black? It was a horrible kind of situation to be in. And I think that at the end, he was a broken man, and he was broken by the New York Times. I don't think, in fact, I say this based on reporting, he probably should not have been managing editor. He probably should not have been executive editor. Franco probably should not have put him on that track, made him think he was going to end up there. People are good at doing different things. Like, I shouldn't be playing baseball. You know what I mean? I know that. And I don't think he should have been executive editor, but he was really good at other things. And so he's a tragedy. He's a heartbreaking story in this book.
Max Frankel.
Max Franco came in after Abe Rosenthal, and his charge from the publisher at the time, Punch Sulzberger, was to make the newsroom happy again. Because the newsroom was really happy for reasons I'm sure is clear now under Abe Rosenthal. And he made some great advances. For example, under Rosenthal, there was very little coverage of gay stuff because I do think he was homophobic. And that meant at the time there was very little coverage of the AIDS crisis, which was unfolding in New York. So there was real life implications of what the New York Times was not doing. The New York Times didn't put the AIDS crisis on the front page until 1983, I think, really late. And one of the first things that Frankel did, I found this in a memo he wrote, was he wrote someone a memo saying, I want to put, I think it was 6 reporters covering this epidemic that was sweeping the United States, hitting gay communities particularly hard. He said, I don't want history to look back at us and say that we failed at the story. He started promoting gay people in the newsroom. He made it a much happier place for gay people. And I think he, in general, tried to make the paper better on those fronts. He did, I mentioned the Gerald Boyd thing as a foible, but I don't want to take away the fact that Franco was trying really hard to change the racial complexion of the newsroom in the face of fierce and, in retrospect, unconscionable resistance from some very talented editors. He did a one-on-one program where he would say, every time you hire a white person, you have to hire a black person. I think it was just, I don't think they were thinking about Latinos at the time. I don't think. So, he did that kind of stuff too. I think the paper was good under him. I don't think it was great under him. I don't think he made it any better, but I think he was a good editor for all those reasons.
In our final 2 minutes, what advice would you give to whoever the poor person is that's going to have to write and pick up where you left off? So from 2016 to whatever the future is, what would you tell them as they have to try to duplicate what you have just done?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about thematics that I could not deal with just because my book ended when it ended. One of which is we need to figure out, or whoever does this book needs to figure out how Trump really affected the New York Times. Like, we know it really brought more readership and struggled with how to deal with words, lies, and it brought dissension within the newsroom. And I think that the paper needs to figure out how to deal with that, and the next writer will have to figure out how to deal with it. I think the next writer will also have to figure out how to deal with a new, I'm going to use the neutral word, spirit in the newsroom. And again, I'm going to use a shorthand now, wokeness. I don't think it's quite as extensive as people think it is, or certainly it was a couple of years ago. But I think that one of the things that we're watching now is the executive editor, Joe Kahn, and A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher, struggle with finding the balance on letting people have opinions and expressing their opinions, but remembering that the place is a collegial place and that it still believes in balance and an attempt, I use this word advisedly, objectivity. But the last one is probably the most difficult one, and I think the paper is succeeding at this, but it's hard, right? And I mentioned this before. It's now a subscriber-driven newspaper, which means that you need to really get readers. You need to give them stuff that they want, and don't throw them away with coverage that they don't like, right? And you need to balance that, getting readers, getting clicks, getting business, with remaining true to the spirit of the New York Times, of being honest and down the middle. And I think that's kind of a hard balance, and I think we're right in the middle of it. But if I was writing the next book, and I don't think I will for obvious reasons, that would be a big theme of it. I mean, already I'm looking at stuff going on all the time and thinking, okay, what themes would I use to define the next book? And I think they're all there right now. I think the next book's going to be great. Not as good as mine, but great.
Well, this is the book, The Times. Adam Nagourney is the writer, and I hope you guys all get a chance to read this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You were fantastic. I really